We do breakfast with benefits to show our support of the nonprofit community in Dane County and surrounding areas. We like to find topics that I find interesting or topical to nonprofits. Um, Moving Out is a client of ours, and I've gotten to know Kathryne very well over 3-4 years now, maybe. And yeah, is it 4 or 5? Yeah, 4 or 5. Yep. And we all know that racial equity is a huge topic of conversation. It's a huge need in the community. And so Kathryne and her organization have really taken this to heart. I know I've seen lots of organizations um, start this process, go through it, but I've really seen Kathryne's organization transform itself with its commitment to this important topic. So I reached out to her, and she graciously offered her time today, and so I'm really excited to hand off to her and hear what she has to say about their journey through racial equity matters. So Kathryne, with that, take it away.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you this morning. Before I start, I want to stress that I am not an expert in DEI or anti-racism. I am an aspiring ally, I would say, right? We don't get to declare ourselves allies. We do the work, and that's really all we can do is just put in the work. So I just want to make it crystal clear that I'm not an expert. I have worked hard to learn about these topics for a very long time. I don't have, any special degrees or certifications or anything at all like that. I'm learning through through action and through many other, more formal, structured learning opportunities, informal learning opportunities, and lots of experience. So with that, I'll share my screen. I have some slides, and I will move pretty quickly through the slides because I do want to, leave time if possible at the end for any questions that you might have. Once I start sharing my slides, I will not be able to see the chat presentation. So
There we go.
Don't look ahead. I'll minimize that as much as possible. Okay, so all right, so again, Kathryne Auerback. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Movin Out Incorporated. I'll say a little bit more about our organization as we progress through these slides. But today I'm just here to share with you our journey so far with this important topic. I'll share some little bit of background information. The message that I really am hoping that folks will take away from our conversation today is a deep understanding of why racial equity matters to every mission, whether your organization is a social justice organization or an arts organization, whether you or others think that your mission is related to racial equity or not. I guarantee you it is, and I hope to make that point really clear today. I'll walk you through our journey so far, some of our successes, some of our challenges, and the work ahead. And then talk a little bit again about how this is connected perhaps to your mission. And I also want to stress that this is an ongoing journey, meaning that this isn't something that you put on your list and then check off your list. It's something that has to be embedded into your organization and committed to as a cultural shift that requires work continuously. There's not really an endpoint to it. All right, so I want to share with you a little bit about Movin Out's guiding principles. We were founded about almost 30 years ago. We're approaching our 30th anniversary. We were founded by a group of parents of children with disabilities, and these children were approaching adulthood. They were various ages, but this group of parents was thinking about their children's future. And these guiding principles were core to the founding of our organization, and they still inform our work every single day. They inform the decisions that we make. They inform how we do our work every single day. And I won't spend too much time defining these. Hopefully it'll become clear as we talk more. Community integration, briefly, meaning we do not work on projects that segregate or congregate people with disabilities in any way. Self-determination, meaning we don't presume to know what's best for the people that we serve. Partnership and collaboration. The work that we do, our mission really relies on a network, a system to be in place, kind of an ecosystem, if you will, to make this concept work. So what we do, we are a HUD certified housing counseling organization, and our focus currently is primarily around home ownership and maintaining home ownership. So helping people age in place as their accessibility or other health needs change over time. We also are a real estate developer. We've been involved in the development and operation of about 1,500 units of affordable rental housing in about 21 apartment projects and what we call our scattered sites, some other rental units like single family homes and duplexes. These are across the state of Wisconsin. And then we, in our operations of those units, we make sure that we are providing assistance for folks who are seeking supportive units that are designated for people with disabilities. We supervise our property management partners, and we provide something called resident services coordination. We don't directly provide supportive services for folks who are living in the supportive units in our apartments, but we coordinate with them. And just to stress the integration piece, no more than 25% of the units in our affordable housing projects are designated as supportive units, and those are mixed throughout the project. So we don't do projects that are just all units, for people with disabilities. That, in our view, is segregation. And then community impact is working to help the folks in those supportive units build social capital, essentially, through community engagement. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on as well. All right, so why does racial equity matter to every mission? Well, a couple of important points to keep in mind. In 2013, you may recall Dane County Race to Equity Baseline Report was published, and it identified significant racial disparities in every category, every single category. Unemployment, poverty, arrest rates, reading proficiency, high school graduation, across the board. I mean, that is just a small sample of the categories where there were glaring wide disparities. So if you pause right now and think about your organization and the people that you serve and whatever it is that your mission is, think about how this might show up in your organization, because I promise you it does. And maybe in the Q&A later, if there's time, if you're struggling to see how it might connect, we can perhaps chat about that. In 2019, the National Disability Institute issued a report around financial inequality, disability, race, and poverty in America. And I've got a long list of quotes from that report, but the important thing to take away from what this report shared is that these three issues are interconnected, intimately interconnected, and however the rates of whatever the rates are of disability and poverty across the board, across our population, they are far worse for people of color. So not only are there disparities in the things that I talked about from the Race to Equity report, but people of color and Black people in particular are more negatively impacted by disability and poverty. Why, again, I think an important moment in our nation's history in 2020, the protests after George Floyd was murdered were the largest sustained mobilization in American history. This type of sustained and diverse activism has a real potential to motivate great social change. And I think, you know, we saw that unfolding. We heard lots of people talking about this issue. This issue was really brought to the surface, and the conversation was on the table. It was unavoidable. If people were not talking about racism in that moment in our history, they were really intentionally avoiding it. There was no other way to avoid it unless you were being very intentional about ignoring it. And then I want to just mention, if you're not aware of a blog, the website is called Nonprofit AF, and yes, the AF does stand for what you think it does. And the author of that blog shares really important viewpoints for our nonprofit sector, and I highly recommend following their blog. And they have also on Facebook a group that has spun off from this blog that's called Nonprofit Happy Hour, and there's a spinoff of that group called ED, as in Executive Director Happy Hour. I highly recommend that group. I have learned so much from that group, not only about issues related to equity, but just any issue related to nonprofit leadership. It is an amazing community of peers, and I've learned a lot from what other folks have posted and what peers have commented, and in some cases from my own questions that I've posed to that group. But this blog in particular, you can see kind of the title there in the URL, so you don't think racial equity, diversity, and inclusion are relevant to your mission. So it's another resource if you want to have a better understanding of why this is relevant for your organization. All right, so I joined our organization in 2018, and prior to that time, there hadn't been a really focused effort or attention around racial equity. Our organization's mission is related to serving people with disabilities. And when I joined the organization in 2018, our board had 0 people of color, and our staff, which was 10 at that time, had 1 very part-time person of color who worked with our organization for a very long time, and was a person with disabilities, and had a job coach, and would come and do some administrative kinds of tasks for maybe 8 hours a week. Also at that time, all of the staff reported directly to the executive director. I was very aware. I was very conscious of the fact that I was joining an organization as a white woman, and without really having particular expertise around serving people with disabilities. And I won't take time to talk about how my background was relevant to this role, but I just felt very conscious of the fact that I was a white person coming into this role, and I wasn't sure yet because I didn't have access to the data, but I suspected that a disproportionate percentage of the clients were people of color. And in fact, that's true. So it was something that I was looking at from before I even joined the organization, and something that I was interested in confronting. And then in 2020, I mentioned George Floyd's murder and the activism that that inspired. And so I took the opportunity at that moment to go to the board and to make the case to say, okay, you know, we've been kind of making some efforts, right? I was making some efforts, and I'll talk about some of those in a little bit. Between 2018 and 2020, I was paying attention. I was trying to change some things, but we didn't have a formal goal around this issue. We didn't have resources committed to this issue. And so I made the case to our board. And for us, it was fairly straightforward. Our mission was a social justice mission. Our guiding principles are based in civil rights, and our organization was really born out of the disability rights movement, founded right around the time that the ADA was passed. And we had completed a strategic planning process in 2019. And as part of the sort of environmental scan, part of that process, we identified racial and economic disparities as major challenges faced by our target population. And we set strategic goals around what you might have heard referred to as the triple bottom line. So not only financial impacts, but social and environmental or ecological impacts as well. So we were starting to look more broadly at our impacts. Then moving on to successes, and I'll circle back around to what we actually did. Currently, our staff has grown to 16. Half of our staff now are people of color, and that importantly, very importantly, includes people in executive roles and program leadership roles. So people on my executive team, people in the sort of middle management layer, if you will. Our board is now 36% people of color, and again, really importantly, including in leadership positions on our board. Our board president is currently is a Black woman. Our current board president is a Black woman. This is cut off a little, sorry, but hopefully you can see that okay. All right, so where did I start? And this really started before 2020. These were some of the things that I was working on between 2018 and 2020. And the first opportunity that I felt like I had was through our hiring process, because we were starting to shift our organization a little bit, and we were starting to grow. And so we were starting to hire people. And this was an opportunity to at least diversify our staff, but it's very, very important to not stop there. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I started with looking at our job descriptions and as a source of unintended bias, if you will, unconscious bias that exists throughout the system. For example, removing unnecessary education requirements. We have been kind of in the habit, it's always been done that way, et cetera, of, requiring bachelor's degrees for many positions, perhaps for most positions, maybe even for your receptionist, for example, or any number of positions that just out of custom habit, we we throw that in, bachelor's degree, maybe even bachelor's degree preferred. And we use that as a tool to determine qualification, when in fact it may be completely unnecessary for the role and the skills and experience that are required for the role. And adding language to every job description requiring participation in our ongoing anti-racism and racial equity work, that came a little later. But I did work with a consultant to review our job descriptions and provide recommendations. So I didn't just make it up. I was working with a person of color who was working in that area of DEI with organizations like ours. The other piece, of course, is I heard this a lot when I was early on in my journey and talking with folks. Well, there's just not very many, people of color in this market. There's not very many people of color who have this skill set. I don't buy it. I just do not buy it. It's if there's time, I'll tell a story from many years ago to bring that point home. But there are lots of people of color. There are lots of very talented people of color in the Madison area. And if your network does not include them, you have to put the work in to build your network and be very intentional about building authentic relationships in communities of color. There is no shortcut. You have to put in the work. You have to show up and put in the work to build those relationships and broaden your network. And then our interview process itself, we made changes to how we were doing that, making sure that it was very inclusive of people from across the organization. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that matters. So again, more on reducing bias in the hiring process, because I hope this is clear, but I'll state it so in case it's not. If your organization lacks diversity, I'll say it even more broadly. If there's a recurring issue in your organization, whatever it is, lack of diversity, mistakes happening too frequently, whatever the issue is, something that's a persistent issue, it's really important, of course, to look at the process. So if we are finding, for example, that mistakes are happening in our, paying our invoices, we look at the process. We look at the process from start to finish and look for opportunities to improve the process to reduce the possibility of errors. So that's what we did in this case. We had no people of color really on our team except for one part-time person. And that person was, with our organization for a very long time. But every time there was a full-time opportunity open, another white person was hired. So looking at the hiring process itself for opportunities to make changes and have different results. Really, really important to create and define a process and make sure that everyone who participates in the hiring process, in the recruitment process, understands that they have to stick to the defined process. For example, we have very carefully crafted interview questions that are designed to reduce the possibility of bias. We instruct our staff participants to only consider the candidate's application materials. We learned the hard way that if people start snooping around online, you open yourself up for all kinds of problems, including issues related to racial equity. And then in the initial phone screen, in the very first conversation that we have with every candidate that we talk to, we say straight up, this is a priority for our organization. and tell me what you understand about this issue. And it's a very broad question, and I've heard a lot of very interesting responses. What it does, though, is lets people know that, we take this very seriously, and everyone in our organization is expected to participate and be on board. And then again, to try to reduce bias, we use a scoring rubric if we have 2 or more finalists. This is an imperfect process, absolutely imperfect. Of course, there is lots of subjectivity throughout this process. We acknowledge that. We're doing our best to reduce the possibility of bias, not eliminate it. We can't really eliminate it because it's so persistent and kind of ubiquitous. And then our orientation and training for all our new team members, everyone gets the history and context and learns about our efforts to date and our future plans around anti-racism. So the second piece that's super, super important, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit distracted because I have a very naughty cat, and she's, of course, when I'm not paying attention to her is when she really is trying to get my attention. In addition to increasing your efforts around recruitment of people of color, that's doesn't do your organization any good if you don't create an inclusive culture. You have to change the culture so that your culture is welcoming to people of color, that people of color feel like they can bring their authentic selves to work and not have to mask their authentic selves in any way to fit into your organization's culture. So how do we do that? It requires board engagement. It requires talking about it with our team. What does an inclusive culture look like? What is our work? What is the, how do we define what we want our culture to be? And what are the behaviors that support that kind of culture? So we created, I'm missing an end quote there, sorry. We created a document back in 2018, actually, that we called our Culture and Group Agreements. And then we have recently revised that pretty intensively and intentionally around equity. And we revisit that document frequently. We also, in terms of accountability, we include that as part of our annual reflection process, which is what we call kind of our annual review or annual performance review process. So folks are held accountable. So those group agreements that we created together as an organization, we talk about those in the annual reflection, and the our team members respond to a set of questions that includes questions about those group agreements. And it's essentially, tell me about examples of how you lived up to these group agreements. Give me specific examples of things that you did that demonstrate that you've upheld these group agreements over the last year. Then another important part of creating an inclusive culture is a focus on continuous improvement. I mentioned that this whole thing is wildly imperfect. Our organization, we see ourselves as a learning organization. So that means that we are not seeking or expecting perfection, but we are seeking and expecting continuous improvement, continuous learning in every realm, including racial equity and anti-racism. So later in 2020, we started working with a DEI consulting organization called Equity by Design. And in the first year that we worked with them, we focused on what we called grounding and planning. And grounding was kind of setting having some basic education for the team, having some very, very difficult conversations around this topic, just to get everyone kind of level set, if you will, more or less. Of course, we recognize that everyone on our team is in a different place in their own journeys individually, and we worked very hard to meet people where they're at. We formed what we called in that year one a steering committee made up of team members who volunteered to be kind of doing the behind the scenes work, planning with the consultant for various workshops and kind of the process piece of the work. And we created together our racial equity roadmap. It was kind of, if you could think of it as kind of a strategic plan around becoming an anti-racist organization. And we used what's called the TOP process, Technology of Participation. Some of you may have heard of this process. It's a consensus-based framework, and it's very effective for any sort of strategic planning process or program planning process. And then early on, we required managers who are white to participate in a training called Unfiltering the Fury, workshop for white managers on reducing racial harm, led by Yejin Lee, a national figure in equity work. And it was quite intense, as that title kind of implies. It was quite intense, but it was very, very powerful. In the second year, we continued to work with Equity by Design, and hopefully you can start to see that we were making a significant investment in this work and making it a priority. We worked with Equity by Design in the second year around implementation support, and importantly, integrating our racial equity roadmap into our overall strategic plan. So it had been about 3 years since we completed our last strategic plan, which was a 3 to 5 year plan. We had accomplished almost all of the goals in our 2019 strategic plan, with the exception of those that the pandemic kind of squashed. But we had, like all of you, I'm sure, pivoted to other work. And so it was time to create our next strategic plan. And I was very clear that I didn't want our anti-racism work to be a separate kind of bolt-on extra thing. I wanted it to become integrated into how we do what we do, into the culture of our organization. So it was very important to me that we integrated it into our overall strategic plan. So Equity by Design helped us with that process. The steering committee transitioned to a design team, still doing similar work, meeting regularly with our DEI consultant, doing the behind the scenes work, keeping the process moving forward. An example would be, crafting, taking the first step on something to present to the whole team for them to react to discuss, to work with. By that point, we had quite a number of people of color on our team, and so we supported them in forming an affinity group. So they had an opportunity to meet together and talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. We offered support to them if they needed any outside support. They haven't to date requested any additional resources, but they continue to meet on a regular basis. And there's a liaison with that group that brings information to me on an as needed basis. So I'm not like watching over anybody's shoulder. They have privacy to talk about whatever they want to talk about. They've come up with lots of great ideas, and some of those ideas have been brought forward and implemented in terms of the anti-racism work of our organization. And then the next kind of phase in the required management training is a training from an organization called the Management Center that's called Managing to Change the World, and that is available online for a pretty reasonable price, and I highly recommend it. Then a next step, and again, this is kind of touching on highlights. I'm going to keep moving pretty quickly here, but we revised our mission statement and we added vision and value statements to explicitly center racial equity. So our new mission statement is shown here. We advance disability justice by co-creating safe, affordable, community integrated homes. By calling out disability justice, which is centered in the intersectionality of race and disability, we're highlighting that important connection. And then our vision statement was around thriving communities inspired by people with disabilities that provide equitable, accessible, and affordable housing for all. So we've got that equity piece in there. And then our values explicitly call out equity, recognizing and disrupting disparities in housing access by empowering the most marginalized people. All right, so some of our challenges, some of our successes that has been, very gratifying to see some of the shifts in our organization. We are absolutely not without ongoing challenges. And the absolute top challenge that we face is white supremacy culture itself. I really strongly, I cannot encourage you enough to Google white supremacy culture by Tima Okun. This is an article that outlines, provides examples of what is meant when we say white supremacy culture. These are things that are part of our culture in this country that you may not recognize at first glance as any kind of relation to white supremacy. There's not time today for me to go into detail about this particular topic, but please, please, please read that article. Some examples of features, characteristics of white supremacy culture include things like a sense of urgency, a focus on individualism, defensiveness, especially defensiveness when we talk about race, and right to comfort. That's huge, huge, huge. Many of the elements of white supremacy culture show up in our conversations about white supremacy culture. Some of our team members get very defensive. They get very upset because they feel uncomfortable and they're not accustomed to just sitting with that discomfort around racial issues. Other key challenges, of course, capacity, both in terms of time and prioritization, as well as funding resources to support our ongoing efforts. We have been in a fortunate position over the last 4 or 5 years to be able to invest in this work and continue investing in this work and make it a priority. It's still a struggle to keep it at the top of our list, to keep it on the front burner, so to speak, not have people kind of drift into their just, getting heads down about their everyday work and responsibilities and kind of sliding back into old patterns of thinking and behavior. So it takes a lot of work to push forward. And then external forces, right? Systems issues that require ongoing advocacy. And again, I don't have time today to talk at length about that, but one example is the way that many private foundations run their grant-making processes. There is racial bias embedded in those processes. One example is, I'm thinking of a grant that we just recently applied to through a private foundation. I won't name, but the process I'm sure is familiar to you. There's an online application. You cannot view all the questions until you work your way through the portal. It requires gobs and gobs and gobs of time. They require lots and lots and lots of documentation, all on the front end. They require lots and lots of documentation around compliance on the back end, reporting, etc. If you are a small nonprofit organization, particularly led by people of color, it is very challenging to invest that amount of time and effort for like a $5,000 grant or even a $10,000 grant. That's just one tiny, tiny example. These kinds of issues are found throughout our sector and throughout the systems that we rely on to operate our nonprofit organizations. So those are enormous challenges that require, and this is why I say it's so important that it's not something that you put on your list and then you check off when it's done. It's not, you know, having everybody attend one unconscious bias training workshop and then check that off on your list that, okay, we've completed our racial equity work now. It's an ongoing fight really against these kinds of challenges. That doesn't mean that you can't make progress, and hopefully the successes that I shared demonstrate that we can make progress. So what do we have to do now? We are in our third year of working with Equity by Design. They're continuing to provide implementation support, and we are transitioning from that steering committee and the design team to what we're going to be calling our equity team for DEI leadership inside our organization. So we are a team now of 16 people. We're not big enough yet to have a role dedicated, a staff role dedicated to DEI leadership, but we are working to put together a team of staff who are interested in taking that on in our organization as a team. We are focusing on team and individual staff well-being. That's a really, really important shift in our culture. It's an intentional push against white supremacy culture to focus on that. And again, I wish there was more time to go into more detail about what that connection is. We're reviewing all of our policies and procedures and making revisions to those. For example, reviewing our handbook and all the language in our handbook. Our partners at Equity by Design are reviewing that with us and provided recommendations about where we could make changes in our handbook language to support the kind of culture that we're trying to create to be an anti-racist organization, and to make sure that our policies all support that and don't inadvertently maintain status quo, which is white supremacy culture. And looking at creating a policy or guidance around even how we make choices about who we partner with, where we get our funding, because again, those external systems can be problematic and can undermine our anti-racism efforts. We're also working with a person of color who is a consultant around leadership training and coaching, and she is absolutely amazing. Also highly recommend her. And working with our leadership team in particular to make sure that our leadership development is approached through an anti-racism lens and address some of the kind of lingering elements of white supremacy culture in some of our leadership team, across our leadership team. And then year 4 and beyond, you know, we are committed to continuing this work and learning from our experiences and continuing our learning in a more formal way as well through professional development opportunities. Making sure that our team members, for example, we have a very high priority on professional development at our organization, and we ask that at least one professional development opportunity each year for everyone on our staff is at the very least led by a person of color. And we are continuing to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion and racism at both the individual and systemic levels that I mentioned. So why is this important for your organization, no matter what your mission is? Another reference that I highly recommend, an article that I have linked there, and I shared a PDF of these slides with Becca, so hopefully she can maybe share these with you if you guys are interested. Nonprofit leadership is out of step with America's changing demographics. So purely from a demographic perspective, if nothing else, the percent of board chairs and executive directors who are white in 2021, almost 80%. And the percentage of the general population that is white, 60%. So you can see the disparity there. Percentage of nonprofits with all white boards that primarily focus on serving people of color is 16%. And the percent of nonprofits with all white boards that do not primarily focus on people of color, still 38%. So you can see in the data that we're maintaining disparities just out of a pure sort of demographic perspective. And why is this not advancing now? Hang on just a second. All of a sudden it's frozen. There we go. And then just a couple of quotes. Why diversity in nonprofit leadership matters. Leaders of color can increase an organization's effectiveness and social relevance by introducing fresh perspectives and lived experience that enrich programming, broaden the organization's reach, and engage in new networks that reflect and inform its mission. And leaders of color can also contribute organizing heft at the local level, an understanding of community dynamics, and a genuine commitment to social change. A board that is homogenous in any way risks having blind spots that negatively impact its ability to make the best decisions and plans for the organization. The blind spots created by a lack of racial and ethnic diversity are particularly concerning, as they may result in strategies and plans that ineffectively address societal challenges and inequities or even reinforce them.
Kathryne, could we take a moment for a question here?
Sure.
So somebody's asking about how some of this might have been funded. You know, the question is whether a board approved it as part of an operating budget or if a specific external funds were sought out to support this work specifically. And this could be open to anybody on the call here with experience or This
is my last slide, so if I can, maybe I could just kind of put a pin in that. So, you know, just really to close out, again, another reference to Nonprofit AF, a blog post from 2020 in June. And if you think back to what was happening in June of 2020, that was kind of at the peak of the activism around George Floyd's murder. All systems are racist. Helping people, animals, and the environment is crucial, but it's not enough. Your work, and I'm going to stress this, Your work must be grounded by racial equity and social justice, no matter what your mission is. All right, so contact information there, and I will stop sharing. And
yeah, and like Kathryne said, we'll make this available to everybody. Thank you so much for being willing to share that. That's not always the case, but I think there were some great reference points to go back to, some articles, some posts that I think if you're just starting your journey would be a great place to start. If you're continuing on your journey, it'll be a good reminder, and so forth. So back to the question that was presented. And again, anybody on the call, if you want to unmute yourself and give your feedback or thoughts. So how do you fund this work? You know, for Moving Out, if I'm not mistaken, it was a specific budgetary item within your operating budgets, correct, Kathryne?
We don't have a separate line item for, anti-racism work. It shows up in our, consulting budget line, so forth. But we did, when I went to the board in 2020 and made the case to make this a priority, I stressed that what I meant by making a priority was investing resources in it, right, on an ongoing basis, making it a part of our strategy. And so, we certainly have, we've been fortunate. We have some unrestricted private donations that we've been able to deploy to support this work. We've also pursued some additional grant funding to support this work, and that's primarily to pay the consultants that we've worked with. And it's very, very important to work with outside experts, and Equity by Design is amazing. They do great work. There are other consultants in the area that do great work as well.
Any other participants on the call have specific funding that they're aware of, either in Dane County or even nationally? Kathryne, I had a question then. Can you talk about maybe some of the small initial wins? I'm a person who likes to build up, momentum, right? And sometimes in order to get the ball rolling, you just need that one win that starts the momentum that really carries you through to bigger and better things. Can you talk about maybe some of those that were early on?
The story that comes to mind, Nick, is a team member that joined our organization in, I guess it was 2020, because everything is like before or after pandemic, right?
Right.
We actually interviewed her in person shortly before the pandemic started. Then when the pandemic started, we paused new hiring for a little while to make sure we weren't going to who knew? And then once we knew we were going to be okay, we resumed that recruitment process. We went back to her, and she was still interested, lucky for us. And she's a Black woman, and she has really been thriving at our organization. It's been remarkable to watch her growth and development over the last couple of years. She told me, and she's told me this more than once, that of all of the places that she's ever worked, including Black-led organizations, that Moving Out is the only place where she has ever felt like she could be her authentic self. To me, that is the biggest compliment. That is the biggest win I could ask for, because if we've been able to create a culture where people feel like they can be their authentic selves, people of color feel like they can be their authentic selves, that's huge. I know for a fact that there are moments that have been hurtful to her, but how we have responded to those moments makes all the difference, right? So we're not saying that we don't have ongoing issues at our organization. Of course we do. We always will, because white supremacy culture and all these external systems and it's ongoing work, etc. We're learning, we're growing all the time. But how we respond when an incident happens, when somebody's harmed, is key.
That's a great testimony right there alone. Yeah, somebody's making a comment in the chat about had an individual donor who wanted to make a specific anti-racism discretionary fund, and that was successful. That's a good idea potentially to consider. Well, I do want to be sensitive to everybody's time and get you back onto your days. Again, we're Numbers for Nonprofits. We help nonprofits manage money with mission. Thanks again to Kathryne for making the time for this amazing presentation today. And again, we'll get those slides circulated around. We've got our next Breakfast with Benefits in March, on March 14th, with Dr. Sarju Patel of Beam Healthcare, and he's going to talk about how nonprofits can save funds while improving operations. And then we've got our Amazon gift card winner is Mr. Tom Pops. So congratulations on that. Yeah, one of the faces that I've seen on the screen the whole time. So thank you for sharing your face. And I hope all of you can have a good day, and you know, hope that this presentation might be something that you consider implementing in your own organization. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Nick. Thanks, everyone.